Well, first of all, I do think it's very important, and in relation to what we're working with, I think there are two different agendas. The first one is to understand the future and opportunities and choices we make in terms of technology. And in that space, we've been working with foresight and future studies to create scenarios on particular futures that have a regard of technological sovereignty within themselves. So I think the first part is to understand that we do have decisions and choices. The choices are region level choices, so it's policy, but it's also business choices, it's how we design the platforms and such. But then again, it's also about identifying what is there in today's life and today's societies that is important for us in order to have technological sovereignty and to understand what role technology could play in the future of our societies. So the first part of our work would be creating those futures and illustrating those decisions and discontinuities in the development. And then the second part would be in creation of very practical tools and ideas through which we can design better platforms and better technologies. And in that space, I actually believe that the election we saw in the US with President Trump elected was fairly interesting, because what it illustrated is that right after the election, we are having a discussion about Facebook as a social actor, Facebook as a democratic actor, and we're challenging Facebook. We're asking difficult questions from Facebook in terms of their algorithms, in terms of the filter bubbles they create through those algorithms. And I think the second part of our work is in creation of very practical tools through which we can design technologies and interventions that make more sense for the society and that enable technological sovereignty instead of just restricting it. So those two approaches would be according. Well, I think the discussion on basic income, it's been emerging now. It's of course an older concept, but we're now seeing experiments and policy discussions in a lot of different countries around the world. And we've been fairly involved in what is happening in Finland in terms of the overall experimentation framework through which basic income experiment is also implemented. I do think there's a lot to learn from basic income, and we've been arguing that we need moonshots, we need ideas to believe in, and through those ideas we can then make policies and create ideas and get people to believe in those ideas. I think with basic income you can only frame it once, and right now there's a lot of discussion about basic income as such, like what is a basic income? The basic income experiment we're looking at in Finland right now is very restricted. I wouldn't call it a basic income as such. It is a variation of basic income that is mostly there to enable people to get employed better. But there are a lot of other aspects into basic income as well. The interesting thing in the Finnish experiments is that it's actually implemented by a center-right government with a populist party in the government. So it's fairly interesting and unique in terms of a policy agenda for that type of a government to play. So a rather conservative government by its agenda. In terms of the basic income as such and as on a more conceptual level, I think it would be important for the left to remember that basic income is universal basic income, which at least to me is firstly universal, secondly basic, and thirdly income. Which is to say that if we only think basic income as an income tool, we're missing a point. We're missing a point in the ability to create a society in which everyone feels empowered and enabled to participate, to have a meaning. And I think that immaterial side of basic income is very, very important for the left. Not just to think basic income as a continuation or a simplification of a social policy or redistribution agenda, but something completely different in terms of the structures and capacities it enables. I think, like, on a city level, there's a lot of action, a lot of interesting initiatives in communication and interaction with citizens, and all of those are important. I think the issue there is that whether or not we learn from each other, and I'm not always sure we do, but I'm hopeful. In terms of what's been done in Helsinki, I think there are two elements that are interesting. First one is that in the youth department, there was a realization that in addition to the macro data, the quantified data, you need more qualitative data. So you need a kind of like grassroots understanding of the experiences and worlds in which youth in Helsinki live. And I think that's something that we often miss in terms of the communication and agenda, which then leads to lack of empathy. And I think that's something that is quite easily applicable to other places and other governments and social structures as well. So to go into the qualitative level, take those insights from people, make case studies, make interviews, ethnography and such, and go from there. The other thing, which is a lot more structural, is that in Helsinki we're now seeing one of the more significant government structures in the city for the decades, which is essentially restructurization of the government of the city structures as such. And one part of that was basically an implementation and design of a participatory model for citizens to engage with the city. And a good friend and former colleague was leading the effort in Helsinki, and I think the result was very, very interesting. They co-created the framework together with citizens, and the end result was a model in which there are three principles. First one is that it should enable the utilization of skills and competencies from each individual and community. The second is essentially the equality of opportunities to participate for everyone, regardless of which parts of the city they are. And the third one is, I need to take a hint, basically enabling autonomous initiatives, so enabling people to create their agenda and put that agenda forward instead of a top-down agenda that's been implemented within the city. So those three as principles of the model that is now being implemented in the city of Helsinki, and I think what is there to learn would probably be, in addition to the outcome, the process and the process of co-creating that type of framework. We're also seeing experiments now with enabling citizen-led initiatives and trying to scale those in other parts of Finland, but those are quite early stage initiatives. But like I said in the beginning, there are a lot of things happening in this space. I don't think anyone does it right, but like if you learn a little bit better, we might be better in going forward.
Just a question that has nothing to do with, it has already been required to answer from you. What is the proportion of population? Sorry, this is a Wikipedia question that I need to answer myself, but now what is the amount of population living in Helsinki versus the rest of the country? Is it a very distributed population, or is it quite concentrated?
Well, right now it's around 600,000, which would be the Helsinki city, but then the metropolitan area would be around twice. And overall we would be looking at 5.5 million. So it's not very concentrated, and historically the policies have been very much towards regional autonomy and kind of distribution of populations. So we have fair amount of universities all over Finland, fair amount of cities as well. But then of course, if you look into the GDP growth, if you look into the economics and population movements within Finland, it's towards the metropolitan area. So it's slowly kind of like concentrating, but like historically the narrative has been very much in the kind of like decentralization. Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think we're seeing ideas emerging in that space. For instance, the My Data movement, which is essentially about autonomy of your data, autonomy in terms of autonomy and authorship, I would say, in a sense, in terms of your data and personal data. The question about these issues in the Nordics is interesting because there's a lot of heritage in the Nordics that has a relation to this. The idea of transparency of government, the legislation of transparency in public documents and public discussions, and how do those adapt into the digital economy and to what parts. So I think we would definitely benefit from having this discussion more, and I think that after the crisis, the economic crisis, we've kind of like the agenda in terms of political discussion has been still hijacked about that narrative, and there's a lot of discussions to be had in terms of where we're going as a regional domain. But then again, the countries in the Nordics are very, very different as well. One idea of the Nordics that I would like to emphasize, which is not a Nordic idea at all, but implemented there from the 60s onwards, the idea of universalism is something that I would very much like to understand better in the space of digital technologies and technological sovereignty, because universalism, it's a very powerful idea. It's the idea behind the welfare state as well. The idea that regardless of your wealth, you get the same benefits, you get the same services and same ideas implemented. And what we know that we don't necessarily like this anymore. We want to have something different and customized. But there's still something there that I don't think we fully grasp in a sense of application of the principle of universalism into the ideas of technological sovereignty, and I would very much like to explore it further. So I think these issues kind of like, also because of the strong traditions of the ICT sector, technological entrepreneurships and such, so there are like communities already there in place, like there are in Barcelona, like there are in Berlin and other places as well. But it's a matter of trying to interpret and contextualize these developments into the wider kind of like Nordic narrative. But yeah, so I wouldn't be too, I think it's an interesting question, but at the same time, like Nordics happen to implement a lot of these policies during the industrialization era and afterwards in that kind of space of societal development. And right now, I don't think we're having the discussion as much as we should in terms of what is the next phase.